You have been told that it takes 21 days to build a habit. You have probably repeated it. Tonight, I am going to show you exactly where that number came from, and it was not a study of habits. It came from a plastic surgeon writing in 1960 about how long it took his patients to stop being startled by their own face in the mirror. Somewhere between his book and your ear, the sentence lost 4 words. Those 4 words are the entire difference between an honest observation and a rule that has been quietly making people give up for 60 years. And when scientists finally did measure it properly in the real world for the first time in 2010, the answer was not 21. It was not 66 either, whatever you have read. The useful answer is a range, and the range is enormous. In the next half hour, where the number came from, what the measurement actually found, what your brain is doing while a routine turns automatic, and 4 things you can take out of this that hold up. Start with the sentence itself, because it is almost never quoted correctly. The book is called Psycho-Cybernetics. It was published in 1960. Its author was Maxwell Maltz, and his day job was reconstructive and cosmetic surgery. What Maltz noticed was not about exercise or diet or getting up early. It was about self-image. He had spent years rebuilding faces, and he kept seeing the same lag. A patient would come out of surgery with a nose that no longer had the bump they had hated since they were 14. The bump was gone. The feeling was not. For about 3 weeks, that patient would still flinch at mirrors. Then, somewhere around the 3rd week, the flinch would stop, and the new face would simply become their face. He saw the same interval elsewhere. A person who lost a limb reported feeling the missing limb for roughly the same stretch of time before the sensation faded. The phantom outlasting the fact, then quietly giving up. People who moved house described about 3 weeks before the new place stopped feeling like somebody else's home and started feeling like theirs. The furniture had not changed. The map in their head had. What he was circling in every one of those examples is a lag between the world changing and the internal picture of the world catching up. Not a lag between deciding to do something and managing to do it. A completely different quantity. And he was in an unusually good position to notice it because his work created that gap deliberately. A surgeon who changes a face in an afternoon has manufactured, on purpose, a mismatch between a person and their own self-image and then has to sit with them while it closes. So he wrote it down. And the sentence he wrote, "This matters, so I am going to read it slowly," was that it usually requires a minimum of about 21 days to affect any perceptible change in a mental image. A minimum of about 21 days to change a mental image. Now listen to what that sentence became by the time it reached you. It takes 21 days to form a habit. Every safeguard is gone. The word minimum is gone, which is what turned a floor into a ceiling. The words about and usually are gone, which is what turned an approximation into a figure. And the subject is gone. Maltz was talking about a mental image, how you see yourself, not about whether you go running. Those are not the same thing, and he never said they were. Consider how large that substitution is. Getting used to a new face is a passive process. It happens to you, whether or not you cooperate, because your nervous system keeps updating a model with or without your permission. Building a habit is not passive. It requires you to produce a behavior repeatedly in the presence of every reason not to. Handing the second thing the timeline of the first is not a small slip. It is a category error dressed as a number. And notice which direction the error runs. Passive adjustment is fast because nothing has to be overcome, so a timeline borrowed from it will always be too optimistic for anything that has to be done on purpose. I want to be careful here because Maltz is easy to make into a villain and he does not deserve it. He described what he saw in his own practice, in his own words, with hedges attached. He did not run an experiment on habits he did not claim to have. He put an observation in a preface, and the observation was reasonable for the thing he was observing. What happened next was not his doing. His book sold in enormous numbers, and every retelling filed off one more qualifier, the way a story does when it passes through enough hands. By the 1990s, the 21 days had detached from the book entirely. It was simply a fact everybody knew, with no author, no method, and no source. And a claim in that state is remarkably hard to kill because there is nothing to attack. You cannot find the flawed study because there is no study. You cannot check the sample size because there is no sample. It also acquired the one property that makes a number spread: it is convenient. 21 days is 3 weeks. It fits a course, a challenge, a program, a January. A number that maps onto something somebody wants to sell will always travel further than a number that does not. There is a test I would like you to keep for the rest of this episode and for the rest of your life, honestly. When somebody gives you a number about human behavior, ask 3 questions. Measured how? In whom? And how wide was the answer? 21 days fails all 3 instantly, and it survives 60 years anyway, because almost nobody asks them. That is the shape I want you to notice tonight, because you are going to see it happen a second time before the episode is over to a much better number. So what does the evidence say? For 50 years, the honest answer was, nobody had really checked, which sounds impossible for a claim that famous. It is not impossible, it is ordinary. Measuring habit formation properly is expensive and slow research is the kind that does not get funded. Think about what you would actually have to do. You cannot measure a habit by asking whether somebody did the thing, because doing the thing is not the same as it being automatic. You did the washing up tonight. Was that a habit, or did you look at the sink and make a decision? From the outside, those look identical. So you need to measure automaticity, not behavior. You need to ask repeatedly, over months, how much did that require you to think? In 2010, a study did exactly that, and it was published in the European Journal of Social Psychology under the title, How Are Habits Formed? Modeling Habit Formation in the Real World. The design is the part worth admiring. 96 people. Each one picked a single new daily behavior that they wanted to do, something eaten, something drunk, or some activity. They picked it themselves, which matters. This is not a lab handing you an arbitrary task. It is people choosing something they had an actual reason to want. Each person tied it to a daily cue. After breakfast, when I get home, the pairing was fixed at the start and kept. Then, every day for 12 weeks, they logged whether they had done it and answered a short set of questions designed to measure how automatic it felt. Not how virtuous they felt, not how motivated, how little thought it took, whether it happened without them deciding. That distinction is the whole methodological contribution, and it is worth making concrete. 2 people both drink a glass of water after breakfast every day for a month. One of them remembers each morning that they are supposed to, weighs it, and does it. The other finds the glass already in their hand. Same behavior, same streak, same tick in the same box, and completely different states. Only the second one has a habit in a sense anybody actually cares about, because only the second one keeps going on the morning they are exhausted, distracted, and not thinking about self-improvement at all. A tracker that counts days cannot tell those 2 people apart. That is why the tracking apps, for all their charts, have never been able to answer the question this study was built to answer. 12 weeks of daily self-report from 96 people is an unglamorous, expensive, deeply boring thing to collect. It is also the only reason we have a number at all. And when you plot those automaticity scores over time, you do not get a straight line. You get a curve that climbs steeply at first and then flattens. That shape is the actual discovery, and it is more useful than any single number in the paper. Early repetitions buy you a lot of automaticity. Later ones buy you less, which means the first 2 weeks feel like enormous effort, producing enormous change, and week 7 feels like nothing is happening, precisely because the curve has flattened near its top. I think this single fact explains more abandoned attempts than any failure of character does. People do not usually quit at the hard part. They quit at the boring part, and the boring part is the part where the work is nearly finished. If you had a dial in front of you showing automaticity, week 7 would show it sitting at 90%, creeping up. Without the dial, week 7 just feels like a week in which nothing changed, which is indistinguishable from a week in which nothing is going to change. There is also a nastier version of the same problem. Because the early gains are so large, the early weeks systematically overpromise. Your first fortnight is the fastest this will ever feel, and you naturally read it as the baseline rate. The researchers then asked when each person's curve reached 95% of its own plateau. That is the moment the paper treats as habit formed. The median answer across the participants whose curves could be modeled was 66 days. And that is the number that escaped the paper, crossed into the world, and started being repeated as a rule, exactly the way 21 did 50 years earlier. So let me do to 66 what I just did to 21, because it is being abused in the same way, and it is a much better number being wasted. First, 66 is a median. Half the people were faster, half were slower. It is not a target, and it is not a deadline. Second, and this is the sentence that should be on the poster instead, the range across individuals ran from 18 days to 254 days. 18 to 254. That is a 14-fold spread inside one study among people who all chose their own behavior and all stuck to a cue. If you had drinking a glass of water after breakfast, you were probably near the fast end. If you had 50 sit-ups after breakfast, you were somewhere else entirely. That is the third thing the median hides. Complexity of the behavior moves the number enormously. A habit is not a unit. A sip is not a workout, which should be obvious and somehow never is, because the language flattens it. We say habit for a thing that takes 4 seconds, and for a thing that takes an hour, involves changing clothes, and depends on the weather. One of those is a single action attached to a cue. The other is a chain of a dozen actions, any one of which can fail, several of which have their own friction, and the chain is only as automatic as its weakest link. So when somebody tells you their habit took 3 weeks and yours has taken 4 months, before you conclude anything about either of you, ask what the two behaviors actually were. Very often that answers it entirely. Now think about what happens when somebody takes the median and hands it to you as a promise. You do a thing for 66 days. On day 67, it still takes effort. Under the honest reading of the study, you are entirely unremarkable. You are simply somewhere in the slower half of a very wide distribution doing a harder behavior. Keep going. Under the poster version, you have failed a scientific benchmark. And the specific damage of a false deadline is that it converts ordinary variation into evidence about you. The 21-day version does this harder still, because 21 is below almost everybody. It is roughly the fastest end of the observed range, sold as the average. So a rule derived from a surgeon's note about mirrors, stripped of the word minimum, sets a bar that most people mathematically cannot clear, and then invites them to conclude they are the problem. There is one more finding in that paper that almost nobody repeats, and I think it is the most practically valuable sentence in the whole literature. Missing a single opportunity, one skipped day, did not measurably damage the process. One missed day is not a reset. The curve does not go back to zero. This is measured, not encouraging noise, which is worth sitting with. Because the all or nothing framing, I broke the chain, I have to start again, is the mechanism by which one missed Tuesday becomes an abandoned year. The study did not say consistency does not matter. Consistency is what drives the curve. It said the process tolerates a gap, and those are different claims. And you can see why both are true at once from the shape of the thing. If automaticity accumulates across repetitions, then one missing repetition removes one increment. It does not remove the accumulated total, because the total is not stored in the streak, it is stored in you. The streak is a bookkeeping device that people have mistaken for the mechanism. Break the ledger and nothing happens to the balance. What the ledger is genuinely good for is the decision each morning, and there the streak is doing real psychological work. The error is only in what happens when it breaks. A tool for showing up has been allowed to double as a verdict. So, not 21, Not 66 either, as a rule, a steep curve that flattens, a spread from 18 to 254 days, and a process that survives you missing a day. Now the other half of the question, which is the one that actually fascinates me, what is physically happening while a thing becomes automatic? For this, we leave people and go to rats, mazes, and electrodes, and to a laboratory at MIT run by the neuroscientist Anne Graybiel. The apparatus is deliberately dull, a T-shaped maze. The animal runs down the stem, a tone plays, and it turns left or right. One direction has a reward. What is not dull is that electrodes are recording from the basal ganglia, a set of structures deep under the cortex, well below the parts of the brain we usually credit with learning. On the first runs, the recordings look like noise in the good sense. Neurons fire across the whole length of the run, entering the maze, moving up the stem, hearing the tone, turning, arriving. The animal is, in the most literal sense, paying attention to all of it. Every part of the sequence is being processed as it happens. Then the runs repeat, dozens of times, hundreds. The behavior gets faster and more accurate, which is what you would expect. But the recording changes shape in a way you would not expect. The firing does not simply get stronger everywhere, it withdraws to the ends. A sharp burst as the run begins, near silence through the middle, a second sharp burst at the goal. The busy middle has gone quiet. The lab's word for that is chunking. The brain has taken a sequence of separate actions and bracketed it into a single retrievable unit with a marker at the start and a marker at the end. Once that has happened, the whole routine can be launched as one thing. You do not choose each step, you trigger the chunk and the steps run. This is why you can drive a familiar route home and arrive with no memory of the journey. The middle of that drive was, neurologically, the quiet part of the recording. It is why you can tie a shoelace but cannot easily describe it. The description would require the middle, and the middle has been compressed out of conscious access. It is why a musician plays a scale as one gesture rather than as a list of notes, and why interrupting them mid-scale to ask which finger comes next often stops them dead. That last effect is worth dwelling on, because it is the cleanest demonstration that a chunk is a different kind of object from a sequence of decisions. Asking for the middle does not retrieve the middle, it dismantles the unit. Anyone who has typed a familiar password by looking at the keyboard knows this from the inside. Your fingers know it, you do not. Ask yourself the third character and the hands stop working. The same is true of a staircase you have climbed 10,000 times. You do not count the steps, but add a step and you will find out immediately how precisely the chunk was tuned to the staircase that existed. The basal ganglia are doing something close to compression. They take a sequence that the cortex is running laboriously, step by step, and glue it into a routine that can be fired whole. And there is a very practical consequence hiding in that. A chunk is efficient precisely because it is not inspected while it runs, which is wonderful when the chunk is good. The whole point of a habit is that it stops costing you anything to decide. It is also exactly why an unwanted routine is so hard to interrupt. You are not fighting a decision. There is no decision in the middle to fight. The place a chunk is vulnerable is at its brackets, the start, where it gets triggered, and the end, where it resolves. Not the middle, where nobody is home. Later, work from the same laboratory found that the start and end pattern is reliable enough to be used as a signature. You can look at the recording and tell whether the behavior has become habitual. That is a striking claim if you sit with it. Whether something has become a habit is not only a matter of self-report. It has a physical signature. And it explains the honest version of the timeline question. What takes weeks is not learning what to do. You knew what to do on day one. What takes weeks is the compression, the slow refiling of a sequence from the deliberate system into a packaged routine. That is a physical process, and it does not care about your calendar, which reframes the whole timeline argument rather elegantly. Nobody asks how many days it takes a wound to close and expects one answer for every wound, on every person, at every age. They ask what kind of wound. The 21-day rule and the 66-day rule after it are both attempts to give a single answer to a question that is about a physical process with inputs, depth, repetition, complexity, context, the individual. And once you see it that way, the 18 to 254 spread stops looking like messy data. It looks like exactly the spread you would predict, and the surprise is that anybody ever expected a single number to come out. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If a habit is a chunk that runs without inspection, how much of an ordinary day is running that way? The best known attempt to answer that comes from the psychologist Wendy Wood and colleagues using diary studies. The best known attempt to answer that comes from the psychologist. The method is simple and slightly brutal. You give people a way of recording, hour by hour, what they are doing, where they are, and what they are thinking about. Not what they intended, not what they remember at bedtime, because bedtime memory is a story. What they are doing at the moment they are asked. Then you classify each entry. Is this something done almost daily, in the same place? While the person was thinking about something else? Entries that tick those boxes are counted as habitual, and the widely quoted result is that roughly 43% of logged behavior fell into that category. I want to handle that number carefully because it is quoted with far more precision than it can carry. You will see it as 40%, as 43%, and as 45%, depending on which study, which sample, and which measure somebody is citing. And a recent replication using modern hour-by-hour logging reports a substantially higher share than the original diary work did. So the responsible statement is not a decimal, it is this. On the original diary method, something like 2/5 of what people did was repeated behavior in a fixed context with attention elsewhere, and newer measurement puts it higher. The direction is the finding. The decimal is not. And notice how much work the phrase "in the same place" is doing in that definition. Context is not scenery. In the diary data, it is part of what makes the behavior a habit at all, which lines up exactly with the maze. The chunk has a trigger. In an animal, it is the start of the run. In a person, it is very often a place, a time, or the end of another routine. That is also why environments do so much of the work that people attribute to character. Change the kitchen and the evening changes without anybody becoming more disciplined. And it is why habits break so easily on holiday, and why moving house is one of the most effective moments to change them. Every trigger you had has been deleted at once. That cuts both ways, and the second edge is the one people are unprepared for. The good routines were also attached to that kitchen, that route, that colleague you walked out with at 6. Anybody who has changed jobs and quietly lost a 3-year exercise routine within a month has experienced a chunk losing its bracket. Nothing about their commitment changed. The trigger left the building. Which suggests, though I am stating this as an implication and not a finding, that the risky moment for an established routine is not a bad week. It is a change of context that nobody thought to treat as a risk at all. The uncomfortable part is the attention finding. A large share of your day is running while your mind is elsewhere. That is not a failure of attention. It is what the compression is for. But it does mean that the question, what do I want to be doing without noticing, is a serious question. And most people have never once asked it deliberately. So what does all of this actually license us to say? I want to be strict here, because this is the point where documentaries start dispensing advice they cannot support. Everything I am about to say is a description of what was measured, under what conditions. It is not a program, and this episode gives no health or medical instruction of any kind. First, from the 2010 design itself, every participant paired their new behavior with an existing daily cue, and that pairing was fixed before the 12 weeks began. That was not a finding of the study, it was a condition of it. The curve we have been discussing is the curve for behaviors that had a fixed cue in a stable context. So if you take one structural thing from the research, it is that the thing being measured was always behavior attached to something. Never behavior floating free, to be done at some point today. Second, from the same paper, the curve is steep early and flat late. which means the subjective experience of week 1 and the subjective experience of week 7 are not comparable measurements of anything. Week 1 feels effortful and productive. Week 7 feels flat and pointless. That is the shape of the curve, not the shape of your progress. Third, the 18-to-2-154 spread means that comparing your timeline to somebody else's is close to meaningless, even when you are both being honest. Fourth, the missed day. One skipped opportunity did not measurably harm the process. Whatever you do with that, do not build a system where one gap counts as a failure. Now the things I am deliberately not going to tell you, and why. You will have heard that some habits are keystone habits, that fixing one cascades into fixing others. That idea comes out of a literature with real replication problems, and I cannot state it to the standard the rest of this episode has used. You will have heard that willpower is a muscle that depletes through the day. Same problem. Large, well-known, widely repeated, and in serious trouble under replication. I am not telling you those are false. I am telling you they are contested, and that a documentary that hands you a contested claim in the same tone as a measured one has done something dishonest. Which is, when you think about it, the same failure that produced 21 days. Not a lie. A hedge quietly deleted somewhere between the source and you. There is one more thing the maze work suggests, and I will flag it clearly as an implication rather than a finding. If a routine is a chunk that runs uninspected in the middle and is vulnerable at its brackets, then the moment worth engineering is the trigger, not the middle of the routine, where by construction, nobody is available to intervene. That is consistent with the diary work, where context did so much of the classification, but it is an inference across two literatures, and I am labeling it as one. So what do you take out of this tonight that is actually worth something? 4 things. 1. When a number about human behavior arrives without a method attached, treat it as a rumor until you find one. 21 days survived 60 years without a study behind it because nobody asked the boring question, measured how, in whom, for how long? 2. Read for the spread, not the average. The single most useful figure in the 2010 paper is not 66, it is 18-to-254. Anytime you are given a median and no range, you have been given the least informative half of the result. 3. Judge a process by its shape, not by how a given week feels. A curve that is steep early and flat late will always make its most productive later stretch feel like stagnation. Knowing the shape is what stops the flat part from being read as failure. 4. Watch what a claim quietly drops on its way to you. Maltz wrote a minimum of about. Both hedges vanished, and the vanishing did all the damage. When somebody hands you a clean number about people, ask what got rounded off to make it clean. And one last thing, because it is the thread running through the whole evening. The 21-day rule is not a lie that somebody told. It is a true sentence about something else, repeated until its subject fell off. That is the more common way people end up believing false things, and it is much harder to defend against than being lied to. Because at every step, somebody was being roughly honest. The only real defense is the boring one. Ask what was measured, in whom, and how wide the answer was. 3 questions. They would have caught this one in 1960. Next Sunday on The Better Self, we stay with the body and change the question completely. Sleep. Not advice about it. The history of how anybody worked out what the night is actually for, when for most of human history, the answer was simply that nothing was happening. The instruments arrived before the understanding did, and the first people to record a sleeping brain did not know what they were looking at for years afterwards. If you got something out of this, follow the channel. That is genuinely the whole thing that keeps these being made. I will see you next Sunday.